thread 10 lessons. One single thread running quietly through every single one of them. You do not control the storm, the crowd, the wave above your hull, or the candle on your desk. And you never actually did, no matter how hard you gripped at any of them. You control the compass you keep consulting on the worst nights, the verdict you refuse to hand down without a trial. The canyon the river is carving out of the rock you did not choose, the air you allow yourself to breathe, and the company whose air you are willing to share. The question you let win each morning before your excuses get a vote. The disaster you rehearse honestly before the disaster ever has the chance to surprise you. The work you would still do even if no one, not a single person, ever clapped for it again. The honesty you finally bring to the candle that is genuinely running down. The hatch you refuse to open from the inside no matter how loud the storm becomes. And the costume you decide, one morning, no longer to wear into the rest of your life. None of this is comfortable. It was never supposed to be comfortable in the first place. Comfort was never what kept Marcus Aurelius ruling through plague and betrayal, or kept Seneca writing through repeated exile, or kept Epictetus teaching for decades after years spent in actual chains. What kept them going was the brutal, clarifying knowledge that their remaining days were limited and unowed to them by anyone, and that the only real failure available to any of us in the end is spending those limited days asleep inside a costume we never actually chose for ourselves. You are going to die. So am I. Neither of us knows exactly when or how, or whether there will be any warning before it happens. But for however many mornings you actually have left on this earth, you now carry something most people spend their entire lives quietly avoiding: the plain knowledge that the storm was never yours to control, that the compass was always yours to keep consulting no matter how hard the wind blew against it, and that today, this exact ordinary day, is the only day you have ever actually been given to finally start doing it. If any part of this reached you, do not let it end when this video does. Do not let it fade by tomorrow morning the way most things do. The lessons will not save themselves, and neither will you. Carry one of them with you, just one, and let it find you in whatever ordinary moment you are about to walk into next. The text you are about to send. The morning you are about to oversleep. The apology you have been postponing out of pride for years. The costume you have been telling yourself you cannot take off. The candle does not wait for you to be ready. It never has. It only burns down. When the hourglass runs out, 10 Stoic lessons for people who feel like they're already late there is a moment, believe it or not, that every single human being shares with every other human being who has ever drawn breath. Nobody has avoided it. Nobody will. It arrives without warning sometimes, and sometimes after a long conversation the body has been having with itself that the mind tried very hard not to overhear. Inside that moment, two things become suddenly, brutally clear. The time you had was always shorter than you let yourself believe, and the choices you made inside that time were the only thing about you that ever actually mattered in the end. The people who have stood closest to that threshold: soldiers dragged from rivers by their own belts, doctors pulled back from the edge of their own grief, prisoners walking out of solitary after years underground, parents who buried a child and somehow still got up the next morning. They described the same thing afterward, almost in the same words. They say the world did not change. They say their eyes did. They say they stopped postponing things. They say they finally understood what the rest of us keep forgetting every single ordinary morning we are allowed to wake up. Roughly 2,000 years ago, a small circle of thinkers sitting in the Mediterranean basin built a way of looking at the world so unsentimental, so stripped of polite fiction, that emperors reached for it in their darkest hour. And so did the slaves who served those emperors, and so did the generals who had just lost their armies. And so did the prisoners who had nothing left except the sentence they were about to serve. They called their system Stoicism, and they did not build it for comfortable afternoons or for people whose worst problem was a slow internet connection. They built it in plagues, on battlefields, in forced exile, in slavery, in the long and brutal aftermath of losing children who did not survive childhood, which was, heartbreakingly, the ordinary experience of the ancient world. It survives 2 millennia later because it was never about ideas for their own sake. It was a manual for survival, forged by people who had nothing left to lose and everything left to do with the days that remained. If you are listening to this because something in your life right now feels unbearable, a loss you cannot stop reaching for, a failure you keep replaying, a version of yourself you no longer recognize when you look in the mirror, you need to hear this clearly before anything else. You are exactly who the next 10 lessons were written for. They are not soft. Some of them will feel like a hand closing around your throat before it lets you breathe again. But if you let them in, if you actually let them reshape the way you walk through the next ordinary day of your one and only life, you will be a different person on the other side of this than you were when you pressed play less on one, the compass that does not need the storm to stop. Imagine a navigator lost at sea in the worst weather his crew has survived in 20 years. The wind is wrong. The stars are hidden. The swells are taller than the mast. The crew is praying to gods the navigator privately suspects are not listening. And somewhere in his coat, against his chest, he carries a small brass instrument. It does not stop the storm. It does not part the waves. It does not lift the ship out of the black water and set it down on dry land. All it does is give him a fixed direction, a true north that exists whether he can see it or not. The crew wants him to grip the wheel harder. The crew wants him to fight the waves with his bare hands. The crew wants him to scream at the weather until the weather apologizes. He does none of that. He trims the sail to the smallest workable size. He tells one trusted sailor the heading they are holding, and he keeps his eyes on the compass while everyone else loses theirs to panic. Most people spend their entire lives gripping the wheel of a ship they were never actually steering. They scream at traffic that does not know their name. They reread old text messages from people who have already forgotten the conversation entirely. They lie awake at 3 a.m. rewriting a past the universe has flatly refused to let them revise. Epictetus, a man who spent years in actual chains before he ever spent a single day inside his own mind that was free, built his entire teaching around one brutal clarifying distinction. Some things are within your power, and everything else is not. Confusing the two is the root of nearly every unnecessary suffering you have ever felt in your short life. Your reputation is not yours. Other people's opinions of you are not yours. The outcome of your effort is not yours. What is yours is smaller than you think, and infinitely more powerful than you realize. Your judgments, your choices, your effort in this exact moment, right now, as you are listening to this sentence. That is the whole territory you actually govern. And it is enough, because it was always the only thing that was ever going to determine whether you suffered or whether you rose. Think about how much of yesterday got swallowed by things you cannot touch. The comment section under a post you should have never opened. The promotion someone else got for reasons that had nothing to do with your actual worth. The weather on the one afternoon you needed sun. None of it moves an inch, no matter how hard you grip it. And every second spent gripping it is a second stolen from the compass you were actually put here to keep consulting for the people who need you to keep heading somewhere true. This is not resignation. It is not surrender. It is the opposite of both. It is the realization that your energy is finite and that you will never get today back once it has passed. Every ounce spent on the uncontrollable is an ounce stolen from the one thing that was always within your reach, yourself, your character, your response to whatever the world decides to throw at you next without consulting you first. There is a small exercise worth trying the next time you feel your grip tightening around something outside your control. Ask yourself, out loud if you have to, is this thing in front of me something I can act on directly right now with my own 2 hands? Or is it something I can only watch and hope about? If it is the second kind, the grip you are holding is not protecting you from anything. It is only exhausting you for absolutely no return, hour after hour, day after day. While the actual work of your life sits untouched, waiting for the attention you keep spending elsewhere. There is a quieter second part of this lesson that most people miss entirely. Once you stop fighting the storm, you are left with an uncomfortable amount of silence because you no longer have the weather to blame for your unhappiness. That silence is not empty. It is the room where responsibility finally lives, uncontested, waiting for you to pick it up. Most people avoid that room for years because blaming the storm is easier than admitting they were supposed to be trimming the sail all along. But the navigator who finally stops blaming the wind is the only navigator whose ship ever actually reaches the harbor. Lesson 2, the injury that happened in your own courtroom. Imagine two soldiers hit by the same arrow in the same battle, struck within seconds of each other in nearly the same place. One bleeds out within the hour. The other survives 3 decades longer and dies peacefully in his own bed at 90. The arrow was the same. The wound was nearly the same. What was not the same, what was never the same, was the verdict each soldier passed on what had just happened to him. The first soldier, on impact, told himself a story. This is the end. I am finished. I was always going to die in this stupid war. None of it ever mattered. The second soldier, on impact, told himself a different story, with the same raw facts. This is bad. This hurts. This changes the next 6 months of my life entirely. But I am still here, and the things I have not yet done are still waiting for me on the other side. The arrow was not the wound. The story the wound triggered inside his own head was the wound. This is the second brutal insight the Stoics handed down across 2,000 years. It is never the event itself that destroys you. It is the verdict you pass on the event, usually within a fraction of a second, usually without a trial, usually without evidence, usually without any chance of appeal from a judge who slept through law school. Someone cancels plans and you rule silently and instantly that you are unwanted. You lose a job and you rule just as fast that you are worthless at some fundamental level. You receive a single cold look from a stranger on the sidewalk and you write it into your permanent file as evidence you do not belong in the world you are standing in. The event happened out there in the world. The wound happened in here, in your own private chambers, and you were the one holding the gavel the entire time. This single realization that our reactions are opinions, not facts, would later become the seed of an entire branch of modern psychology built on retraining exactly this kind of automatic punishing self-verdict. But long before any laboratory confirmed it, Stoic teachers were telling their students the same thing in the middle of a plague-ridden, war-torn world with none of our modern comforts. Strip away your opinion about what happened to you, they said, and look at what is actually left underneath it. Usually what is left is far smaller and far more survivable than the story you wrapped around it in the space of a single panicked heartbeat. You are not required to believe every verdict your mind hands down the instant something goes wrong. You are allowed to appeal. You are allowed to ask, is this actually true? Or is this just the fastest, most familiar way my mind knows how to suffer because it has practiced suffering this exact way 1,000 times before? The people who master this question stop being victims of their own thoughts and start becoming judges of them instead, which is a fundamentally different way to move through a single day on this earth, and it changes everything downstream of it. Consider how differently those two soldiers might have lived the rest of their lives, depending only on which verdict they happened to hand themselves in the first 5 seconds after impact. One of them ruled himself dead, the other ruled himself still alive. The arrow did not know the difference. Only the verdict knew. Try this the next time something wounds you today, this week, the next time life catches you off guard. Separate the raw event from the story you immediately wrapped around it in the first few seconds. The event is neutral. It happened. It is finished. It cannot be changed no matter how much energy you spend wishing it otherwise. The story is yours, freshly written in real time. And stories, unlike events, can always be rewritten with a steadier hand once you notice who is holding the pen. Consider how much of your own personal history has been shaped not by what actually happened to you, but by the earliest verdict you happened to pass on it, sometimes as a child too young to appeal any ruling at all. A single offhand comment from a parent, absorbed once, repeated for decades as a permanent fact. A single failure in front of classmates in third grade filed away as a life sentence about your own ability. The event lasted seconds. The verdict has been serving its sentence for years, sometimes decades, entirely unexamined, because no one ever told you the courtroom was still open for a retrial. Lesson 3: the canyon, the river, was not supposed to make there as a place on the American continent where, over the course of several million ordinary years, a small river carved a canyon deeper than most skyscrapers are tall. The river did not ask permission. It did not negotiate. It did not wait for the rock to apologize for being in the way. It simply kept moving forward, day after day, with no more drama than water ever has, and the rock that refused to move was the rock that got shaped instead, slowly, then faster, then deep enough to see from space. The rock did not lose. It became something the rock on flat ground, untouched by any river, can never become. The obstacle in the path became the path itself, not in spite of the obstacle, but because of it. Without that unmovable rock, that river would still be a quiet creek running through a pasture somewhere, unmemorable, unvisited, unknown. A prisoner named Marcus Aurelius, who happened to also be running an empire at the time, wrote to himself in the dead of night, in a journal he never intended for a single other human being to read, that what blocks the action can be turned into the action, that what looks from the outside like the thing stopping you is, very often, the exact material the thing itself has to be made out of. There is no version of himself writing that journal without the obstacles he was writing it inside of. Plague, war, betrayal from people he personally trusted with his life. The journal is what was made out of those obstacles. Without them, the journal does not exist. Without them, Marcus Aurelius is a forgotten emperor of middling rank. This was not a slogan he repeated for comfort on his worst nights. It was a working method he used to survive years that would have broken almost anyone else who ever wore a crown as heavy as his. Every difficulty placed in front of him was reframed deliberately, forcibly, as material to be worked with, not punishment sent to destroy him, but material sent to shape him into the only kind of ruler who could still be trusted to lead after everything had already gone wrong. Most people treat hardship as personal proof that life has turned against them specifically, as though the universe has singled them out for cruelty unavailable to anyone else on earth. A marriage ends and they read it as evidence they are unlovable at some fundamental level they cannot fix. A business fails and they read it as evidence they were never capable in the first place, and never will be. But the river did not read the rock as evidence it was never meant to reach the sea. The rock was simply the mechanism by which a quiet creek became a canyon worth seeing from orbit. Your setbacks are not verdicts on your worth. No matter how convincingly they disguise themselves as one in the moment, they are more often than not the exact resistance required to forge whatever you are supposed to be becoming, whether you asked for that resistance or not. This does not mean you pretend the pain does not exist, because that would be its own kind of lie the canyon did not tell itself. Cutting stone genuinely hurts stone. The river knows it. But there is a difference between denying the obstacle and deciding what the obstacle is for. One path leaves you a creek forever, terrorized by every rock you encounter, flinching at the memory of being deflected. The other path leaves you a canyon, deep enough to stand inside, deep enough to change the climate of the entire region around you. The next time life places a rock directly across the only river you were trying to run, ask the river's question instead of the victim's question. Not why is this happening to me, as though the universe owes me an explanation it will never provide, but what shape is this obstacle trying to carve out of me, and what canyon is hiding inside it that I cannot see yet? Because something is always being carved in that moment, whether you cooperate with it or fight it every step of the way. There is a version of you on the other side of every river that was supposed to break you, and that version did not exist before the rock. Lesson 4: the air you are breathing without noticing there is a particular kind of illness that passes silently between people who share a room for long enough, even when nobody touches anyone and no one coughs. The ancient Romans had a name for it. And so did every culture that ever watched a whole household mysteriously fall sick within a week of each other with no obvious cause. We now understand the mechanism, but the Romans understood the pattern long before the mechanism. You breathe in whatever is in the room with you, whether you chose to or not, whether you noticed it happening or not, whether you wanted it or not. Seneca warned his students about exactly this invisible contagion nearly 2,000 years before modern research confirmed it under a microscope. He said that we never return home from certain company with the same character we carried into it. That something rubs off on us whether we notice it happening or not, the way a sick man's illness can pass to someone who never touched him, only stood in the same room and breathed the same air for long enough. Character, in this sense, is not built alone in a room with your own good intentions and a motivational poster. It is built in rooms, among people, and most of us never once audit the rooms we spend our entire lives standing in. There is a reason certain rooms feel exhausting to leave and other rooms feel energizing to leave, even when nothing dramatic happened in either one. The exhausting room was quietly asking you to shrink to fit it. The energizing room was quietly asking you to grow to meet it. Most people never name this difference out loud, and so they keep choosing the exhausting room simply because it is familiar, mistaking familiarity for belonging. Ask yourself, honestly, what standard the 5 rooms you spend the most time in are quietly training you to accept as normal, and they are training you, whether you agreed or not. If the people around you treat mediocrity as an acceptable outcome, some part of you is being trained to accept mediocrity as acceptable too, no matter how loudly you insist otherwise inside your head when no one else is listening. If the people around you gossip, cut corners, shrink from difficulty at the first sign of resistance, you are absorbing a blueprint for gossip, for corner cutting, for shrinking, even if you never once consciously agreed to any of it out loud. This is not permission for cruelty toward the people currently in your life, and it is not a call to abandon everyone who has ever disappointed you in some dramatic act of self-improvement broadcast to anyone who will listen on the way out. It is a call to honesty about what proximity is doing to you silently every single day, whether you are paying attention to it or not. You do not have to burn every bridge tonight, but you can start choosing deliberately, with real intention, to spend more of your limited hours near people whose standards are higher than the ones you currently hold for yourself, and fewer hours near people who have quietly been giving you permission to stay exactly where you are. There is also a mirror side to this lesson that most people conveniently forget. You are not only a passenger absorbing the standards of the rooms you enter, you are also, whether you like it or not, contributing your own standard to every room you walk into. Someone else's character is being written, in some small part, by the version of you they spend time around. That is not a burden meant to paralyze you with guilt. It is the other half of the same truth. And it means the choice to raise your own standard is never a purely selfish one. The rooms you stand in are writing your character whether you are paying attention or not, and you are writing a line or two into every character standing near you as well. The only real choice available to any of us is whether we choose the rooms and the lines we contribute to them on purpose, instead of by accident, instead of by default, instead of by drift. Lesson 5, the baker who was already ahead before the town woke up there, is a particular kind of baker whose bread somehow always tastes better than every other baker for miles around. Even though his ovens are not newer, and his flour is not more expensive, and his recipes are not secret. The difference, it turns out, has nothing to do with bread. The difference is that he was already kneading dough 2 hours before his nearest competitor even sat up in bed. He is not doing this because he enjoys being awake before dawn. He does not enjoy it. He asked his own apprentice once, on a difficult morning, whether he ever enjoyed it, and the apprentice watched him pause long enough to admit that he never really had. He did it because he understood something most people never bother to learn in their entire lifetimes. The loaves do not care how he feels this morning. The hungry still arrive at first light. The town does not pause to ask the baker whether he slept well, and the ovens have never once decided of their own accord to light themselves. Marcus Aurelius argued with himself about this exact struggle in the pages of his own private journal, the same journal he never intended anyone else to ever read. He wrote about the pull of the warm blanket, the temptation to stay curled beneath the covers instead of rising to do the work he was, in his own words, born to do as a human being with a finite number of mornings left. If the most powerful man in the known world had to argue himself out of bed on some mornings, you are not weak for feeling that same pull every single day. You are simply human, exactly the same as he was underneath the title and the crown. But notice carefully what he actually did with that pull, instead of simply losing to it. He did not indulge it. He did not shame himself for feeling it either, because shame rarely gets anyone out of bed faster and usually keeps them there longer. He simply asked himself a sharper question than the blanket was asking him. The blanket asks, wouldn't it feel better to stay warm for just a few more minutes? The sharper question asks, what was I actually made for? And is staying warm really the answer I want to give myself on this particular morning? Most mornings, staying under the blanket wins by default, simply because nobody bothered to ask the sharper question out loud before reaching for the snooze button. Winning the first hour of your day is rarely about discipline in the way most people imagine it, all gritted teeth and white-knuckled willpower dragged out of thin air for one heroic morning and then abandoned by Wednesday. It is about deciding the night before which question you are going to let win in the morning, before you are tired enough to negotiate with yourself and lose the negotiation you never saw coming. The people who rise early and build extraordinary lives out of ordinary days are not immune to the pull of comfort. They have simply trained themselves to notice the pull. Name it honestly the moment it arrives, and choose the sharper question anyway, morning after morning after morning, until it stops requiring a fight at all and starts feeling like who they simply are. There is a deeper reason this particular lesson matters more than it first appears to. The way you meet the very first hour of your day sets the posture your mind will use to interpret every hour that follows it. Lose the first hour to the blanket and the excuse, and you spend the rest of the day in a slightly apologetic catch-up posture, chasing a version of the day that already escaped before it began. Win the first hour even by a small margin, and every hour afterward inherits a small advantage it did not have to build on its own. Tomorrow morning, before you reach for the excuse that is already waiting for you, ask yourself the sharper question. What were you actually born to do today, with the limited number of mornings you have left on this earth? And is 5 more minutes of warmth really worth trading it for? There is nothing glamorous about this particular lesson, and that is exactly why so few people actually apply it. It does not promise a single dramatic transformation. It only promises that tomorrow, and the morning after that, and the one after that, you will meet the day slightly earlier than your excuses expected you to. And that small margin, repeated for months, becomes the largest and least visible advantage a person can build. Pause here for a moment before we continue. Because if you have made it this far, something in what you just heard is already working on you, whether you noticed it yet or not. Most people who watch something like this will let it wash over them for an hour and then return by tomorrow to exactly the life they were living before they pressed play. That is not a judgment against you. It is simply the ordinary gravity every human being has to fight the pull back toward the familiar, even when the familiar has quietly stopped serving them. Of the 5 lessons you have just heard, which one landed the hardest, and why do you suspect this particular one was the one that landed? Usually, the lesson that stings the most is not a coincidence. It is the one pointing directly at the exact place in your life where you have been quietly avoiding the truth for longer than you would like to admit, even to yourself, in the privacy of your own thoughts. Lesson 6, rehearsing the earthquake before it ever comes. There is a city on a famous fault line whose residents go through a strange drill once a year that visitors find incomprehensible. They are asked, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, with no warning and no real earthquake in progress anywhere nearby, to behave exactly as they would behave if the ground were already shaking beneath them, where they would stand, what they would grab, how long they would wait before moving, and where they would move to. They rehearse the disaster as though it were happening, once a year, until the rehearsal becomes indistinguishable from instinct. The visitors laugh. The residents who have lived through a real earthquake never laugh at the drill again, because they know exactly what it bought them. The drill did not stop the earthquake. The drill did not even reduce the earthquake. The drill stripped the earthquake of its single most lethal weapon, which was always, and only ever, the element of surprise. The Stoics practiced a version of this deliberately, sitting quietly in their own homes and imagining the worst possible outcome of whatever road lay ahead of them next. Not to invite misfortune closer, not to dwell in misery for sport, but to strip fear of its single greatest weapon, the version of dread that arrives only because you never once let yourself look at what you were dreading until it was already standing in your living room with the door closed behind it. Seneca wrote that nothing should ever come as a total surprise to a person who has prepared themselves honestly, that we should send our minds ahead into every possible difficulty on the road, so that when difficulty actually arrives, we greet it as something rehearsed rather than something that ambushes us from behind while our guard is down. Most people do the exact opposite of this. They avoid even the thought of loss, as though thinking about it might somehow summon it into being by name. And so when loss inevitably comes anyway, as it comes to everyone eventually, no matter how carefully they plan, it arrives as a total stranger they have never once prepared themselves to meet, and they collapse onto the floor in a way that proper, unglamorous rehearsal would have prevented. This is not pessimism, no matter how similar it might sound on the surface. A pessimist expects disaster and does nothing at all to prepare for it emotionally, simply waits helplessly to be crushed by whatever comes. This is closer to a soldier checking every buckle on his armor before a battle he sincerely hopes he will never actually have to fight. He is not checking the buckles because he wants the battle to come. He is checking them because if the battle comes anyway, despite every hope otherwise, he would rather meet it standing on solid ground than meet it caught completely off guard with his armor half-fastened. There is a particular kind of freedom hidden inside this practice that is easy to overlook at first. Once you have honestly sat with the worst outcome and found that you are still standing inside the thought of it, something in you quietly relaxes for the first time in years. You stop spending your daily energy defending against a catastrophe you were secretly terrified even to name out loud. The catastrophe has already been named, examined, survived in your imagination. And what remains is simply the ordinary work of living, unburdened by the weight of an unspoken fear that was draining you long before the actual disaster arrived to confirm what you had been quietly dreading all along. Try sitting just once this week with the honest thought of losing something you currently take completely for granted, whether it is your health, a relationship you assumed would always be there, the career you have built over years of effort, not to torture yourself with worst-case scenarios on a loop, simply to notice, with genuine relief, that you are still standing even inside the thought of it, and that the version of you who survives that imagined loss is sturdier and steadier than the version of you who refuses to ever look at it directly. The people who fear loss the least are rarely the people who have lost the least in their lives. They are almost without exception the people who stopped pretending loss was avoidable and started preparing for it, like the residents of that fault-line city, long before the first real tremor ever reached the surface beneath them. There is a strange side effect that shows up once you practice this regularly, one the residents of that city likely notice but rarely speak about. The things you have honestly rehearsed losing become, paradoxically, things you appreciate far more while you still have them. The sailor who has imagined the ship going down watches the sun rise from its deck differently than the sailor who has never once let himself consider it. Gratitude, real gratitude, does not usually arrive on its own. It arrives on the back of a clear-eyed look at how easily everything you currently hold could be taken from you tomorrow, and how unprepared you would be if it were. Lesson 7: the recipe that does not need the crowd to taste good. There was once a chef in a small city who for years built his entire sense of himself around how many people made reservations at his restaurant each week. On packed Saturday nights, he walked taller. On quiet Tuesdays, he sat alone in the kitchen after closing and wondered whether he had wasted his entire life cooking food that nobody actually wanted to eat. It took him until his final years to notice something devastating about the whole arrangement. His recipes had never once changed based on how many seats were filled. Only his sense of himself had, and he had spent 30 years handing complete strangers the power to decide whether he was allowed to feel proud of his own hands. Epictetus taught his students to draw a hard, unforgiving line between what belongs to us and what belongs entirely to other people's opinions of us, and applause belongs entirely to the second category. No matter how good it feels in the moment it arrives, it is not yours. It was never yours to begin with. It arrives and departs based on moods, trends, fashions, and circumstances that have absolutely nothing to do with the actual worth of the work you did that day. The moment you build your identity on top of applause, you have quietly handed over the deed to your own self-worth to a crowd that will change its collective mind about you before the week is even over. This does not mean you should stop caring whether your work is genuinely good. Indifference to quality is not what any of this is about, and a Stoic would have been a terrible craftsman. It means the measure of whether your work is good should live inside your own honest, demanding standards, not inside the fluctuating size of the crowd happening to watch you perform it on any given afternoon. The chef whose recipes stayed exactly the same on the packed Saturday and the empty Tuesday had already done the actual work of making good recipes long before either crowd showed up or failed to. What changed was never the recipes. What changed was only how loudly the world happened to be clapping for them that particular afternoon, for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Ask yourself, honestly and without flattering your own answer, how much of what you do each day is aimed at genuine excellence, and how much of it is secretly aimed at being seen doing something that merely looks like excellence to whoever happens to be watching. The two are not the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside for years at a time. Only one of them will still feel worth doing on the day the crowd finally stops watching entirely. And eventually, for every single one of us without exception, the crowd does stop. There is a quiet test worth running on yourself here, one that takes only a moment. Imagine the exact piece of work you are proudest of, your finest work. The thing you would point to if a stranger asked you what you had ever made that mattered. Now imagine that no one, not a single other person, will ever know that you were the one who made it. Does it still feel worth having made? If the answer is yes, you have found something real, something that belongs to you in the way the Stoics meant it. If the answer is no, you have found gently and without judgment a place in your life where applause had quietly become the entire point. Build the version of your work, and the version of your character, that would still feel worth having even if no one ever clapped for it again as long as you lived. That version, and only that version, was ever really yours to keep. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person once they finally stop performing for the crowd, and it is worth naming honestly, because it can feel at first almost like loss. The applause was loud, and its absence presses in from every direction like silence itself. But underneath that silence, if you stay in it long enough without running back toward the noise, is something sturdier than applause ever was your own private opinion of your own work, arrived at honestly answerable to no one but you. Lesson 8. The candle burning down on your desk. Imagine the only light in the room is a single candle on your desk. You have been ignoring it all evening while you answered emails you did not need to answer. Scrolled through arguments between strangers on the internet you will never meet. Replayed the same 5 minutes of an old conversation until the conversation itself lost all original meaning and became nothing but a loop. And then, just as you finally reach for the thing you actually wanted to do tonight, you look up and notice the candle has burned down to a stub no taller than your thumb. The flame is barely sustained. The wax is pooling at the base in a way that tells you honestly you have only minutes left before the room goes dark. This is not how most people think about their own lives. Most people assume the light will simply keep working forever, like the electricity they pay the bill for, until one ordinary evening they look up and notice the stub is already there. And the wax is already pooling, and the room they thought had unlimited light has only minutes left in it. Seneca made a claim that still unsettles people today, nearly 2,000 years after he first wrote it down in a letter to a friend. Most life, he argued, is not lost through some single dramatic tragedy that arrives unexpectedly and takes everything at once. It is lost quietly, a day at a time, handed away to distraction, delay, and the comfortable, unexamined assumption that there will always be more of it later, when there is not. He said, "We do not actually have a short life. We simply waste a great deal of the one we were given. And the waste is so gradual, so invisible day to day, that most people never even notice the candle shortening until there is almost nothing left of it to notice." Looking honestly at your own mortality is not the morbid exercise most people assume it must be from the outside. It is closer to what you would do if you finally noticed the candle not to be paralyzed by the candle, but to be precise about how you spend the light that is actually still left. When you let yourself feel, for even a single honest minute, that your days are numbered and that the number is entirely unknown to you, something remarkable happens almost immediately. The petty argument stops feeling worth having. The apology you have been withholding out of pride suddenly feels urgent. The work you have been postponing for some day demands, quietly but insistently, to be started today instead. This is not about becoming afraid of death, or letting that fear paralyze the very life you are trying to protect from it. It is about using the plain fact of death as a filter for everything you do while you are still alive to do anything at all. Would this argument matter to me on what might be the final day of my life? Would this grudge I have been carrying for 9 years actually still matter on that day? Would this fear that quietly shaped so many of my decisions without my even noticing still be worth obeying if I knew this was the last morning I had to obey it? Most of what currently feels enormous in your life shrinks almost instantly once it is placed next to the true, undeniable size of the candle. That is not an excuse to stop caring about anything. It is a permission slip to start caring, with full attention, about the things that actually deserve the attention of someone whose light is not unlimited. There is a particular kind of courage that becomes available to you only after you have looked honestly at your own remaining time. A courage that has nothing to do with recklessness, and everything to do with clarity about how much light you actually have left to spend, and a refusal to spend it on things that were never going to matter when the room finally goes dark. Look at your own candle honestly just once this week, the way you would if you noticed the wax pooling without warning on your desk tonight. Then, spend what is left of the light like someone who finally understood at long last that the flame was never going to last forever, no matter how ordinary every previous evening had felt, when you assumed there would always be another flame waiting to be lit. Lesson 9, the submarine below the storm. There is a vessel that, by design, can travel through waters no surface ship could survive for a single minute. From above, the ocean is chaos, towering waves, violent wind, no horizon, no shelter, no logic. But the submarine has paid no attention to the storm on the surface for a long time. It has its own atmosphere entirely. It generates its own breathable air. It maintains its own interior pressure. It moves at its own chosen depth. The storm above is loud, and the storm above is real, and the storm above cannot touch 1 cubic inch of the chamber where the crew is currently having breakfast. The Stoics describe something remarkably similar living inside every human being who has ever walked the earth, an inner vessel that external circumstances cannot actually storm unless we ourselves open the hatch and let them in willingly. Insults, setbacks, cruelty, betrayal by people you personally trusted, all of it can hammer against the outer hull of your life relentlessly, day after day. And none of it can actually touch the innermost chamber where your character lives, unless you personally hand over the key to whoever happens to be attacking your hull that day. Most people live as though every insult, every setback, every unkind word from a stranger has already breached the inner chamber and reached the part of them that decides who they fundamentally are. But notice, if you look closely enough, how often the actual damage was self-inflicted, not by the enemy outside the hull at all, but by the officer inside who panicked in the noise and threw the hatch open without ever actually being forced to. The storm above your hull is loud, frightening, and almost completely unable to reach the room that actually matters, unless you happen to be the one who lets it in out of fear, exhaustion, or the unexamined habit of opening every hatch that rattles without first asking what is actually on the other side. Building this inner vessel does not happen by accident, and it does not happen overnight, no matter how badly you want it to. It is built the same way any real vessel is built, one deliberate plate at a time, through the small, unglamorous daily practice of noticing when you are about to hand over the key, and choosing instead, in that exact moment, to hold on to it a little longer than you held it yesterday. Every time you feel provoked and pause before reacting, you are welding another plate. Every time an insult lands and you notice it landing on the outer hull rather than sinking into the inner chamber, you are welding another plate whether you realize it or not. There is also a strange comfort in remembering that the storm itself is rarely personal in the way it feels in the heat of the moment. The wave does not hate the submarine. Most of what attacks your peace each day is simply the ordinary chaos of a world that was never built around your comfort in the first place. And once you stop taking the storm personally, it becomes far easier to keep the hatch closed against it. The next time life sends a storm that clearly did not consult you about where to land. And it absolutely will sooner than you think remember that the vessel was built to hold against exactly this. The only real danger was ever the officer opening the hatch from the inside, and you, more than anyone else alive, are the only one who has ever held that particular key. It is worth remembering that no vessel stays watertight forever simply because its hull was strong on the first day it touched the water. Seams loosen, hatches rust. Officers grow careless after too many quiet voyages without serious weather. The inner vessel works the same way. It requires maintenance, not because the design was flawed, but because anything built to withstand pressure eventually needs the pressure checked and the plate repaired. The people whose composure seems unshakable in any storm are rarely people who built their vessel once and forgot about it. They are people who walk the length of the inner hull daily out of habit, long after the last storm ended, and check the welds they cannot see.